Hi, this is Andrea Harkins at themartialartswoman.com. You are exploring the culture, adventure, and impact of martial arts with Sifu T.W. Smith.
Hey, this is T.W. Smith, where we do explore the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. If it's your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. I believe that you're going to find the information that I share here is educational, at least most of the time, and entertaining some of the times. But it has always been done with the idea that, we as martial artists can continue to research, check, double-check our craft, and irregardless of the reasons that we may practice martial arts, we can always share and learn from one another, irregardless of the styles, too. And which reminds me, up and coming in the very near future, I'm going to have a fantastic interview with Hanshi Doug Perry, who was in Okinawa training karate in the 50s and 60s. I know that there's going to be something in there for almost everybody. Another thing that I want you to know, just in case it's your first time here, or as a general reminder if you've been here with me for years, I can say this with 100% sincerity because I've communicated with them, met many of them, and trained with quite a few of them, that you are in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world, people who do put in some real sweat, some real effort, and really make an effort to understand their martial arts training much further than just punching, kicking, or looking for the latest and greatest secret technique. And if you're one of those kinds of folks, I'm glad to have you, and you're always welcome here. This particular podcast took me quite a bit longer to produce. One of the things I just learned over the past couple of weeks is that anytime you're doing something, particularly like podcasting, that can get a little bit technical in some areas, if you introduce even the smallest new piece of equipment, it can absolutely derail everything you got. Well, if you ever do anything like this, what you want to do is get it set up and then glue it down so no knobs can move, nothing else can happen. Then put a blanket over it so nobody else can touch it. And then maybe put it in a vault so that it's just there and you walk into it and then you lock it down when you get in. Because I introduced one other little piece of equipment, and by the time I had totally recorded this whole thing with the understanding that everything had been working fine for years, it had a snafu in it. So we got that fixed up. I had to go back and actually, this is my second time doing this, but it's all good. I would rather take my time, do it right, because that's what y'all have expected me, and I expected myself to, put out something that's at least a good piece of quality, and not just rush through it. So I appreciate your patience as I worked out some kinks on this end. This particular podcast is a follow-up to the last one we did, where we were taking Peter Consterdine's 1-yard rule and the egg timer. Now, I'm not going to be going all the way back through. If you missed the previous episode, please go back and listen to that, because some of the terms and understanding that I'm going to be referring to here in flow will be done with the understanding that you already know what I'm talking about. And I gave this episode a title of Decision Calisthenics. And it was the type of thing where we're doing this work where we develop understandings like we did here in the previous episode about what actually can affect our ability to act swiftly. And then what happened was, as I was preparing my curriculum for the practical martial arts class to submit it to the World Combat Association, which is a fantastic organization. No politics, good people, and most importantly, good support and feedback. And one of the things about good teaching, for example, friend of the program, agent of action, Ian Abernathy, who you can find his work anytime by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ian, is that a lot of times when Ian is teaching things, I think of it as almost like universal, because you could theoretically employ his strategies and approach almost anywhere you are, in virtually any country. However, just like he often says, you've got to know the laws that govern your area. And if you're going to set up a curriculum and get it approved by the World Combat Association, you have to demonstrate that you've done your due diligence. And so I thought, well, let's combine a couple of these things. I'm already doing some of this work. I've already got some of this work done. And we just had a podcast that segues beautifully into the topics I wanted to cover today. In the previous podcast, the 12 factors that affect your swift response that you can get to by going to kungfupodcast.com/BeSwift, where you can listen to that podcast, download the PDF of the summary main points and a couple other references. We discuss things like having too many tools, the risk compensation principle, action triggers, decision fatigue, sequential elimination, and that the stress response will directly affect your ability to act. So in this particular podcast, I wanted to begin to explore where and how we could shave time. We understood these things, so are there places that we could actually go in there and perhaps shave off a quarter of a second, all the way up to a second? And as those of you probably know very, very well, a half a second in a fluid situation is a vast amount of time. We also discussed some various situations that police officers may find themselves in, some ideas about some things we may find ourselves in, and we have a couple of new examples in this particular podcast that we want to look at. And with the goal here for us to understand that we're not just trying to make a fast decision, but also an appropriate decision. So let's put these things together and let's see if we can't find a way to shave off a little bit of response time and what we would need to know and how to practice it in order to do it. We've discussed ideas and concepts on how to train and things that we could implement into our programs, and we're going to dig into that a little bit further today, and we're going to start with the Department of Justice report. And I would like for you to consider some of these behavioral traits as they may be applicable to you. The report is titled, Violent Encounters, a Study of Felonious Assaults on Our Nation's Law Enforcement Officers. They have 50 officers that were victims of violent assaults, and 33 of these victim officers never realized that the attack was forthcoming. Now, these are trained officers, and they didn't even see it was coming. Well, their study is going to give us some behavioral characteristics of the officers who were assaulted or killed. The first behavioral trait they give us is that the victim officers tend to use less force than other officers felt that they would use in similar sets of circumstances. And how does that apply to us? Are you prepared to use enough force to control a situation and to get yourself home safe? And I don't just mean mentally. Do you do the sort of conditioning that would allow you to generate enough force if you needed it to control a situation? The second behavioral trait is that the victim officers tend to perceive themselves more or less as a public relations person than law enforcement. I'm not exactly sure how that might relate to us as a trait, but it did remind me to accept things for how they are as compared to how I would prefer them to be. The third behavioral trait of the victim officers is that they used force only as a last resort. And as well, their peers claim that they would have used force at an earlier point in the similar set of circumstances. The victim officers waited too long to use force and ended up reacting rather than acting. Another behavioral trait that they have is that they said that the victim officers didn't always follow all the rules, especially in regards to making arrests. They would get into confrontations with prisoners. There were some problems at traffic stops, and that these officers also didn't follow all the rules about waiting for backup when it was available. For us, it's an interesting conversation because what are your rules? Do you have rules for engagement or rules for your action triggers? Do you have rules about how you communicate to someone who's coming into your space? Do you have rules set up, for example, with your son? So in case he hears a code word, he knows exactly where to get behind you and what his responsibilities are until the dust settles. By the time we're done with this podcast, I'm quite sure you're going to consider a few rules of your own. And these next 3 traits I lump together as one because they really kind of speak to one concern in my mind, and they're listed as the officer felt that they could read others or read situations and would allow their guard to drop down because they were relying on their ability to intuitively read what was going to happen. They also tended to look for the good in others, and they were somewhat described as being laid back and easygoing. I put all 3 of those things together because they speak to the fact that perhaps we're not as aware or as alert as we need to be in those little edgy, kind of mildly suspicious situations. And I wanted to share with you a few of the situations that's just happened around here recently. A caregiver, for example, who is attacked while they're trying to get into the car. If you've never been to the assisted living facilities, retirement communities, senior living facilities, which I still work in regularly, one of the things that you might want to know about them is that they are usually tucked away in a little quiet part, either off the road or out and away from high traffic areas. And most of these facilities have around-the-clock caregivers there. Quite often, particularly the ones that are getting off in the evenings, are pretty tired, long day, taking care of folks, and they're just thinking about getting to their car to get home and get some rest. And they don't look into the shadows as they unlock their car. Something else that we deal with a lot around here are problems around gas stations. North Carolina headlines, October 2017, couple shot by man with assault-style rifle at the gas station. Another one, Raleigh police seek a man who's in the convenience store assault. And even last night as I'm teaching, one of the ladies who's been through one of my self-protection classes came up to me and she says, "Thank you so much. I had to use last night exactly what you taught us about the number one thing that you have to protect is your space." Well, last night she's at a gas station. She observes the guy doing the shadow dance, and before he could get in close to her, she's got her hand up, posturing herself and giving verbal commands. She made the good decision in a timely fashion, and it worked out well for her. Anytime I go into a gas station, I immediately slide into a high awareness phase. I even have posted on my personal Facebook page, and I believe I did on Twitter as well, that there is more than enough crime going on around here for us to stay in an awareness phase. One of the things that you may not know about me is I don't really watch the news at all. But I do once a week or once every 2 weeks, depending upon how I have it set up, is I get a report of crimes that are committed in areas that are important to me. So, for example, where I live or where my mom lives and places like that. And for me, if I watch the news and I hear it day in, day out, it begins to desensitize me. But if I get a report with a clump of numbers, it immediately keeps me frosty and makes me aware that there is quite a bit of activity that I need to make sure that my son knows about and that the people that I train know about. And to give you an idea, just in this area, the county that I live in, they had 266 thefts, 132 assaults, 15 shootings, 31 robberies, and 80 burglaries. And that was just last week, and there was a few other crimes also reported like arson and vandalism. And if you know that these types of things are happening, one of the things that you want to make sure that you can do is that you want to make better decisions faster. And the biggest faculty that gets hindered by the stress response is your ability to make a fast and good decision. But one of the things that can help us quite a bit is to know the laws. They can actually help you shave off time in the sequential elimination process, and also the fact that if you understand that there are common themes, certain situations that if you practice more regularly, you will perform faster because you understand better what's happening, as compared to going through a conscious, slow, algorithmic process to try to figure out what to do as compared to using an action trigger and an intuitive process. And a former criminal defense lawyer, Micah Schwartzbach, wrote an excellent article titled Limits on Self-Defense. And just remember, my goal here is to share examples and the research with you. I'm really not trying to tell you how to set up your protocols, but to encourage you, one, to have some, and then also to learn the laws that are in your particular area, your state. And Micah begins by writing that self-defense is designed to protect people who don't start trouble. It fundamentally doesn't apply to the aggressors. He also says that the most basic definition of aggressor would include someone who illegally attacks another. Some state definitions of aggressor also include a person who threatens to attack another or intentionally provokes a fight. As a general rule, the aggressor isn't entitled to self-protection coverage. Micah gives us this example. Assume Strauss approaches Vaughn. Strauss grabs a baseball bat and waves it. Then he shouts threats to kill Vaughn. To protect himself, Vaughn punches Strauss in the gut and grabs the bat. As the aggressor, Strauss isn't entitled to forcibly defend himself against Vaughn's act of self-protection. Now, of course, Vaughn doesn't have the right to continue on with the bat or anything, but it gives you an idea that at that point, Strauss is not going to get self-protection coverage because Vaughn punched him in the gut. However, despite the general rule, aggressors can gain the right of self-defense in certain circumstances. And Micah writes that in order to earn the self-defense right, an aggressor who has employed deadly force must generally withdraw from the conflict and in some way communicate that withdrawal to the other person. Here's his example. Suppose that Donald tries to stab Steve in the neck with a knife. Steve fights off Donald so successfully that Donald runs away and he hides, and Steve pursues him. Donald has to communicate to Steve that he's done with the confrontation in order to have any right to self-defense. Otherwise, after Steve has pursued him, he may be thinking that Donald is simply just regrouping himself in order to attack again. Donald, who is initially the aggressor and using deadly force, has got to communicate his withdrawal to Steve. Another rule that will apply in several areas is what is called the stand your ground rule, or sometimes it's known as the no retreat rule. North Carolina, the state that I'm in, has the stand your ground rule. And the fundamental theory behind it is that people who have done nothing wrong shouldn't have to run in fear from their attackers. In the states that do not have the stand your ground rule, it is a general requirement that the duty to retreat arises only if the threatened party is actually aware of the opportunity to completely escape safely. This opportunity to escape safely isn't something that just pops up in the flow. And the other part of that Micah writes about is that you have to be able to completely escape safely. And then in the process of trying to escape, not putting yourself at further risk of attack. And the last law I think would be really important for you to consider as you're setting up your protocols is the castle doctrine. For the most part, there's very little disagreement across the states about what is appropriate when it comes to self-protection in your home. Even in the states with the retreat requirement, people generally don't have to run from their homes or their cars, even when they know that they could do so completely safely. There are some specifics of the castle doctrine laws that will vary from state to state, but generally, innocent people who are under attack in their home are not required to retreat. So in summary, some of the laws that Micah Schwartzbach, a former criminal defense lawyer, brought to our attention here in the U.S. for us to consider is that as a general rule, aggressors don't have the entitlement of exercising self-protection, but they can regain that right if they withdraw and then communicate their withdrawal to you. Check your state or the states that you travel into regularly for the stand your ground rule. Now, my personal preference is to use the avoid the situation if I can escape the problem, or if everyone I'm with can escape the problem with no risk of attack, then that is the path that I'm going to take first. And the last one was the castle doctrine, which applies to you, of course, in your home, but in many states it also applies to you while you're in your car as well. So you would want to check that out. So those were the common themes of the laws, but here are some of the things that have been written about as far as common questions here in the U.S. The first one that I actually have already mentioned to you here is you're standing there at the gas station, perhaps you have someone with you, and you see someone starting to approach you. How do you respond? How close do they get to you before you start taking some actions? Another common question that I saw during the research is that you're going down the sidewalk or you're walking out of a building, whatever it is, and someone says something very derogatory to you, some sort of prejudicial slur of some kind, and then they spit on you. Now, in North Carolina, that raises the bar quite a bit, because in North Carolina, assault is defined as the attempt of unlawful or unwanted touching, and that battery is the completion of that act. Well, spitting is considered part of battery. What is your trained response? Someone makes a derogatory remarks to you, then they spit on you. Now, I can tell you what my personal emotional state would be. I know what mine is, and fortunately, mine is not what I feel about it, it's what I've trained myself to do about it. The third situation I want to give you here that shows up quite a bit is that you are threatened, and then he raises a hand. Now, under North Carolina state law, you are already under assault, and you don't have to wait for the battery to occur before engaging and protecting yourself. And the fourth situation that showed up a lot in the questions being asked across various states is when someone is blocking the door for you to enter or exit an area. And it just so happens just yesterday, I saw in one of those magazines a guy who was teaching self-defense skills, and one of the things he actually brought up is what to do if a guy's blocking the door for you to get out of, and how to hit him here and how to hit him there. Obviously, he's never read the laws that are associated in most states of the U.S., because you want to consider a couple of these things. First, is the person blocking you from getting in or out of a facility? Blocking you from getting in would have to reach some sort of threshold that there was some danger imminent inside of there. For example, you hear a child screaming, or you hear some other kind of struggle going on inside. But the other one that is much more common is that someone blocks you from getting out. Perhaps you're going in a heated discussion, things are getting more animated, and you're going to stamp out. You're just going to go out, catch your breath, try to get your mind squared away a little bit, and then as you're heading out, they block the door. And they say to you, you know what? I'm tired of it. You're not leaving this time. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to finish this conversation now. What is your response? Now, by most state laws that I read, if you strike that person, you are the aggressor and just committed a battery. However, it is also unlawful for anyone to imprison you against your will. So you really want to choose wisely here. If you strike out like that self-defense guy who was teaching, just to go ahead and hit him and move him out of the way, there's a good chance that you're not going to have to worry about it, because somebody's going to be coming by to pick you up. However, from what I also read, there's nothing wrong for you to continue to reach for the door if you want to walk out. Or you can also avoid some of that, step back and call 911 and report that you're being held against your will. But those were some common situations that you might really want to consider as you're developing your action triggers, so that you're not going through a conscious thought process so much that you've got a good response already built in and you know what you're going to do deep down inside. So if we know some of the laws that we have to be concerned about, and we also just listed some common situations that we need to be concerned about, how do we go about actually exercising our physical and mental skill of making good and fast decisions? And there was actually a very good study done by Judith Anderson at the University of Toronto in 2016 titled A Training Method to Improve Police Force Use of Force Decision Making. And it all starts with how stress affects critical incident outcomes. They write that when an individual encounters a potential threat, the body engages in a series of automatic physiological processes in response to that threat. And during a physiological stress response, the autonomic nervous system is alerted and that system is divided into two separate systems. The first, the sympathetic nervous system, what I call the gas, and that is activated quickly in a threatening situation. And then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which I refer to usually as the brakes, and it is responsible for calming and stabilizing the body. There are three main factors that determine at what degree do you have the stress response in a threatening situation. And here's the first one: your cognitive perception of how much of a threat that stimulus actually is. The second is your perceived control over the situation. And the third main factor is one that often doesn't show up even in training until the rubber hits the road. And that is stored memories that get triggered by the sensory input, and it makes us recall an experience. And if you've been in the martial arts for a while, you've probably seen it happen where you're doing some sort of role playing or sparring and someone has an emotional response or a defensive response that is out of proportion to what you're actually working on. And it is something that they will eventually have to work through in order to have good self-protection skills. Because one of the things that we're trying to do here is we're not trying to eliminate the sympathetic nervous system's response. We're trying to keep it under control, because a moderate amount of the sympathetic nervous system's arousal is beneficial for us in performing optimally during a critical incident. And here are 6 benefits of the moderate sympathetic nervous system arousal. The first is alertness. The second is a focused attention. The third benefit is improved cognitive performance. The fourth is that it facilitates memory formation. The fifth is that it enhances memory retrieval, which would explain the stored memory problem we just discussed. And then the sixth is that all sensory perceptions, including visual, auditory, and olfactory senses, are enhanced during the process. But remember, what was critical to these benefits was that it was a moderate amount of sympathetic neural system arousal, not an overload. So how do we do that? How do we get a moderate sympathetic neural system response where instinctively, if you're untrained, you may go to the high levels and end up in shutdown? And in the study, they give you 4 core components of training yourself to taking the best action. And the first is that getting an education about the physiology of the stress response system, energy management, and fueling yourself for peak performance. The second core component of training is instruction on how to use your mental focus and visualization, say for example in your meditation, to enhance sensory perception and situational awareness in performance and non-performance setting. The third is how to use biofeedback, and that doesn't have to be fancy stuff. I mean, it could just be something as breathing rates and heart rates, and you can measure those like on some of those new fancy watches. And practice engaging in controlled breathing exercises that have been shown to enhance sympathetic nervous system control during stress. And the fourth core component is dynamic training during realistic critical incident scenarios. And that means have your instructor giving you feedback as you're actually working on a scenario or a situation. But you'd want to remember that in this study, and hopefully just the way it is happening in your dojo or your kwon or your training hall, or even if you're out in the backyard working with one another, is that dynamic training principles include with it 3, 4, 5 consecutive, brief, no threat, slow motion, critical incident scenarios. So basically, walk through it. Take your time. Make sure that you cognitively have a good idea about what you're doing before you progressively rev it up a little bit. So just like the study explained, let's take a moment and look at those 4 core components a little bit further, just in case. Some of this may be old news for some of you, but sometimes it's good to review the old. I do it quite a bit myself, and it helps it stay fresh in my mind. When it comes to the first one, it said an education about the physiology of the stress response. Very briefly, what it basically means is that your senses, what you touch, what you feel, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, That information is sent up to the amygdala, which is the area of your brain that contributes to emotional processing, and the amygdala interprets the images and sounds, and if it perceives danger, it immediately sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. It is the hypothalamus that alerts the autonomic nervous system, and then the adrenal medulla, which is the center of your adrenal glands on top of each kidney. The adrenal medulla is hardwired into the sympathetic nervous system, and it fires off the secretion of adrenaline, and the process begins. The second core component they mentioned was visualization and forms of meditation, and using a mental focus or concentration to stay in the moment. Your ability to focus allows you to filter out the extraneous factors that are not associated with the moment at hand. There are numbers of good concentration exercises, but the best results will come if you'll pick one exercise, such as for example, chanting or an incense or breathing exercises, and stay with it so that you can really sharpen the tool and use it, preferably every day for at least 3 or 4 weeks, which makes this a perfect time to remind you that January the 1st, 2018 is the start of the 11-day meditational challenge. I do it every quarter on the first day of the month, and for 11 days straight, I'll post a video that will help you either resurrect or continue with your meditational program. If you want to join, just go to simplemeditationalprogram.com and get signed up. But if you're already participating in a regular meditational program, using visualization is extremely important because it allows you to directly activate all of your senses, particularly what you hear, see, and smell. It also provides you an opportunity to change the perspective to which you're experiencing the sensory input. I teach several visualization perspective changes, but one of those is titled Be the Audience, and it just allows you to observe the same situation from a different perspective. The third component they had on there was biofeedback, and I use 3 primary around here when I'm teaching someone, particularly those people who have concerns with whether or not meditation actually does anything, or if it actually has any effect on their actual physical body, and they don't just want to believe the sciences. So we have respiration rates, we have heart rate, and then I also use a skin temperature gauge, a digital one that I can just put on their skin, and they can actually watch their temperature adjust as they relax. I also have another device that actually measures your brain waves as you meditate, and you can see it on your iPad change as you go through various brain activity states and exercises. And when it comes to breathing exercises, in the study they write, quote, "Controlled breathing is not a relaxation exercise. Rather, it balances the activity of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system during stress, facilitating states of moderate arousal and blocking panic reactions and hyperventilation responses that can lead to maladaptive sensory responses such as tunnel vision and auditory exclusion," end quote. Then the fourth core component they had was the dynamic training. Have your instructor there going through the process, starting off slow, being progressively. Ian Abernethy has some of the best pad drills that you can find. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? The man's got them out there for free for you. And if you want more, like his throws, I would really encourage you to get his application that you can pick up. But you can go through pad drills, sparring drills, and at this stage of training, you're trying to design a program that gets your sensory nervous system aroused, but also that you can enhance control and the situational awareness so that you can perform optimally. A central benefit of dynamic training is that the instructor has objective evidence to determine if the student has indeed learned the skills based on their performance, as compared to asking them, well, how did that feel to you? We would much rather have something as objective as possible in order to train and to train with. With all of that being said about the stress response, it's just important to remember that there are both psychological and physiological aspects of the stress response. During the intense moments where the amygdala sounds the alarm, the central nervous system fires off, adrenaline begins to pump, that rush of fear runs through you, and you go through the freeze, flight, and fight moments. Then one day you train through all that. And then the instructors will say, quote, an individual will revert to the automatic actions they have been trained to perform, end quote. So basically, if you bust your rear end and go through it one day and something happens, you will act based on how you've trained. And as martial artists, it is so important for us to remember. There's that quote that is often attributed to a Navy SEAL, and it says that basically, we will not rise to the occasion. We will sink to the level of our training. And the actual quote is attributed to the Greek lyrical poet Archilochus, and it was intended for soldiers of that time. And the quote actually says, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. And as Natalie Frank wrote, it was intended to explain that, quote, the ability to succeed is not based on some type of godly superpower someone is born with, such that they can simply expect to succeed knowing it will happen due to their exceptional abilities. Success is based on the human ability to train to the point that when faced with a critical situation, someone has practiced responses so many times that it has become an immediate reaction occurring without thought, end quote. And that brings us to one more component that affects our ability to act swiftly, and that is decision fatigue. It is a real variable that may not affect you necessarily in the training hall, but can directly affect you out in a community setting for sure. Let's say that you're on a trip, a vacation, or a business trip, and that you've just got that feeling of just being mentally exhausted, where you know you just don't want to have to make one more decision. You are now in decision fatigue. And if you're in a new city, for example, and just plan to go out, chances are your awareness is going to be subdued due to the fatigue. However, according to the research studies, you can offset to a degree decision fatigue. It is interesting to know that the average person makes about 35,000 decisions per day. There are a number of ways to reduce the effects of decision fatigue. Of course, remember, and also, the more important those decisions carry a different weight. But one of the things that you can do to help offset decision fatigue is to make plans. So instead of trying to decide whether or not you're going to train, put it on your calendar, put the alarms, put some sort of leverage on yourself that you have to show up. Many very important people, whether they're CEOs or presidents, are aware of decision fatigue, and they pre-plan a lot. For example, what they're going to eat, where they're going to eat, when they're going to work out, so that a lot of the burdens of deciding is lifted off of them. Another way to offset decision fatigue was to have a theme day, which basically what they were saying is group chunks of a day. Now, I've used this technique for this particular program because it would be wearing on me to read here and try to decipher research there, and then when am I going to try to write out the program, and when am I going to record it, when am I going to edit it, then get all that ready to publish it, get the artwork, all that stuff. So what I did is I rearranged my schedule so that I have more lessons occurring on certain days, more classes on others, and that Kung Fu Podcast had a couple of chunks of time dedicated to it. I'll also hear this with martial arts students. When they come into the training facility and it's free time to train, they'll say things like, should I work on my footwork? Should I work on my joint lock? Should I work on my preemptive strikes? Or should I work on my bone conditioning? And after a long day at work, sometimes they just struggle to decide what to work on. If you have days that have different themes to it, it makes the decision a lot easier for you. A third way to offset decision fatigue was one that we were taught all the time when I first began Chinese martial arts, is that if we had a question, for example, what should I practice today? We were taught to follow this pattern. Practice the last two things you were taught first after warming up. Then practice the more yang activities, hitting the poles, the bone marrow exercises, bone conditioning, sparring, all that kind of stuff. Then finish with the yin activities, meditation, breath regulation, reading, visualization, those types of things. So that was our process, priorities first. Another way to offset decision fatigue is to have a uniform or things that you train in regularly. Get them packed up. If you wear a gi to practice, then your decision is already kind of made for you, right? And it just takes some pressure off. You know what you're going to wear. And the fifth thing that you can do to help offset decision fatigue are naps, snacks, and the brief breathing and meditation training. Those types of things can help replenish the decision energy after a long day. But it is really important for you to remember that decision fatigue is a real phenomenon, and it will affect your ability to make the best and fastest decision. It may not apply to you all the time, but if you're going to be in a position where there is a reasonable possibility that you're going to be in the orange on Cooper's color code, then you might want to take a nap before you go out. And that brings me into the last section, deciding which techniques or protocols that you're going to practice and practice regularly. It might be helpful to know that firefighters learn to mitigate the symptoms of the stress response as they occur, and they recover quickly from a maximum heart rate. And if you've ever watched firefighters work, man, it is incredibly stressful. As any individual approaches maximum heart rate, there's going to be immediate impact on performance, and those things can be observed. For example, tunnel vision, having difficulty to speak clearly, even some short-term memory loss. As we approach a maximum intensity, there can be an immediate impact on performance that can be observed. For example, tunnel vision, difficulty in speaking clearly. They've even reported short-term memory losses, diminished hearing, and a loss of coordination, and those are very real symptoms of the survival stress response. At onit.com, they have an article that was titled, How to Maintain Cognitive Function and Fine Motor Skills During High Stress. And they wrote, quote, "The stress encountered by firefighters is extreme at times and must be addressed in training if they're going to be prepared to meet the challenge faced in the line of duty. The natural physiological response, fight or flight response to stress, may limit a firefighter's performance by impairing cognitive function and inhibiting access to fine motor skills. It is critical that you learn to manage incident stress in a safe training environment to optimize performance, prevent injury, and return home safely." End quote. You'd want to remember that the body cannot differentiate between the stress experienced during an emergency incident and the stress experienced during a high-intensity workout. As a martial artist, how are you going to use this fact of science? If you're practicing self-protection, you have got to learn how to train with some high intensity and then carry out your techniques and your objective. So, for example, jump some rope for a couple of minutes and then go through them. But when it comes to you deciding what you're going to train on and how you're going to train, it's a good idea to understand that there are three types of motor skills primarily. You have fine motor skills that refer to the muscle control required to make those small, precise type of movements, such as like opening a car with car keys. Well, try that under stress sometimes. Those types of fine motor skills begin to deteriorate usually at 115 beats per minute in the general population. But also remember that the amount of conditioning and training under stress, as a practitioner, you will have more control over your performance. The cool thing with some of those too is that you can also objectively measure how you're doing when your heart rate gets up to 115, 120 beats per minute. How are you doing on a small, precise test? And that may not necessarily apply to you. Maybe you don't have those type of fine motor skills. But, if your martial art is based on the ability of the empty force and knocking somebody over with your chi, or if you've got the ancient acupoint striking with the tip of your finger type of training program going on for your martial arts, you might want to make sure that you can actually put a key in a keyhole before you're relying on the fact that you're going to catch me in small intestine 7, wherever that is, and get me with your secret punch. Your dim mock training may not work if your heart rate gets up too high. Not to mention some of the other flaws in that theoretical approach, but I won't go there right now. because it is all by itself something that you might want to consider. For example, if you're trying to apply intricate locks, they may work fine, but you're going to want to practice those when your heart rate's about 130 to 140, because you're going to have to rely on a feel for where you are. And that's not the same thing as just trying to reach out during a general practice with excellent accuracy and just touching something and going through the process. But before any of you write me or call me to let me know about your ability to carry out fine motor skills under stress, I'm not saying that you can't do it. What I'm saying is that you have to form and perform a training protocol that allows you to practice under intense situations to carry out precision strikes or intricate locks, just like the military guys have to do all the time. Right? Wrestlers' heart rates get way over 130, and they will really stay focused and carry out sometimes some very intricate locks. The second type of motor skill is what is called a complex motor skill, and they begin to deteriorate at approximately 145 beats per minute. Complex motor skills combine both fine and gross motor skills using hand and eye coordination that are timed to a single event. Then lastly, you have the gross motor skills, which are normally enhanced as the heart rate reaches 150 beats per minute, and the gross motor skills are the movements that just pretty much move the large parts of the body. For example, when you're running, punching, or kicking. But even the gross motor skills can begin to deteriorate when the heart rate gets over 175 beats per minute. So you're going to want to train with some high-intensity stuff in order to make sure that you can carry out your objectives. So what's important to consider when you're trying to decide on some of the mechanical things that you want to practice is, first, be critically honest on how much time you're willing to spend on your training, because you will default to the level of your training, not raise to the level of your expectation. Besides the fine, complex, or gross motor skills that we were just talking about, you're going to want to know when you're trying to decide what to use and practice that there are three types of bilateral coordination. You have symmetrical movements, which both hands do the same thing at the same time. And an example would be pulling up your pants or pulling up your socks. Those are symmetrical movements with your hands. Then you have asymmetrical movements, which are alternating movements, which happens, for example, when you're swimming. Or for another good example for martial artists is a standard armbar. One's pulling up as the other's pressing down. And it is the varied intention in both arms that creates the pressure in the joint attack. And then the third type of bilateral coordination is the reciprocating dominant hand, non-dominant hand. But basically there you're using one hand to perform a task while the other hand assists with other finer types of skills. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Bubishi, some of the winning techniques, for example, number 8, twin dragons playing in the water, is a good example of a bilateral symmetrical movement. Number 9, the scissors on the ground, where you're pretending to fall over, or the double palm pressing, where the palms come together and press down, like in the Nahan Shikata. In the Tai Chi Chuan or Bakwa, you have separating the mountains and gathering the clouds, are another good examples of bilateral techniques. I guess what I'm saying to you is that at a fundamental level, you really want to make sure that you have your bilateral symmetrical movements down pat. When it comes to the asymmetrical or alternating techniques, then just pick one technique that you can master. And if you're not sure which one to pick, look at what your kata or your form tells you. Choli foot, for example, has a lot of long hands. Many of the fundamental strikes are asymmetrical or alternating. For example, the Gua Choi, the Charp Choi, Jung Choi are all practice techniques at a fundamental level asymmetrically. I also made a note here that one day I had asked my teacher while I was training the combative forms of Tai Chi Chuan why there were so many of these wave hand-like cloud techniques and single whips in the form that we were doing. And the response was, because it is very important that you know those very well. Well, looking back at it, single whip is a good example of a reciprocating type of technique, where the dominant hand, for example, is delivering an axe handle strike toward the cervical area, while the other hand is either lassoing a limb or involved in some sort of limb control. And then finally understand when you're trying to make the decision about what to train or practice is that the argument of whether or not you can do precise or fine skills or complex motions is always going to be there. And it literally comes down to your level of training, the types of training that you do, how committed are you to practice under intense levels, and then make something of that training to carry out your objectives. But understand that we will all break down eventually. It's just physiology. Also, stress decreases accuracy and increases the time it takes to make a decision. Again, it's just physiology. It's not a judgment of the person. And then practicing your skills under stress can be improved upon. It is also physiology, but you must be objective and sincere about the amount of time that you're going to put in. Peter Constantine said that officers he had trained were allotted as much time for their training as a real martial artist would put in for their training in just 2 weeks. Basically, they didn't have any time allotted for them. So if you want to improve upon your training skills and your performance, then a lot more time to it and follow a protocol that works for you. Where do you think an officer, for example, with only 2 weeks of training allotted for a year is going to fall? He's probably going to be lucky if he can get gross motor skills with symmetrical coordination down. And that is going to be on the outside chance. So I know that this was a long podcast, and to be honest with you, I was going to break it into two, but I just felt like it would serve better to just go ahead and just share it all with you at once. So in summary, through this process, we said that stress responses are trainable. The second is that more training you put in and the way that you do it, the better you can make yourself. The third is that there are three main factors that determine the degree of the stress response you're going to have. We looked at neurological and hormonal components of the stress response. We listed 6 benefits of having moderate stress responses, the 4 components of the stress response training that influences your ability to make decisions, your motor skills, and offsetting decision fatigue. The 7th main point was deciding which techniques you're going to practice foremost and first in your protocols. I gave you 3 types of motor skills and 3 types of bilateral coordination. And then the 8th thing that I wanted to make sure that I reminded you of is that we discussed the impact of having particular behavioral traits. Make sure you work on your mind just as much as you do your body. There's various laws that cover different regions, and your willingness to understand and practice inside the laws to which you live and travel will make a difference on how you perform in a critical situation. Well, thank you so much for sticking it out with me and showing up here at the end of this particular podcast. I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts were or how you've implemented some of this into your training programs. You know that the more that we learn, the more that we apply, and the more that we practice, the better we're going to get. Have a great practice, and I'll be talking with you soon.